Hello, everybody. And if I have learned anything over the past few months doing this completely online, it's that first and foremost, I miss having an audience so much. Your participation is missed dearly. And I know that we talk on the discussion boards and everything, but it's just not the same. Secondly, there is no lighting, no room with lighting. That doesn't make me look like I've been awake for the past 2 weeks. I assure you that's not the case. Despite my little bit of illness last week that you know about, I have actually been sleeping quite well. So I guess I'm just looking tired all the time. But I assure you there's energy here. So that's the good thing. The third thing I learned is that I have recorded this lecture 3 times. This is try number 4. And all 4 times there was something that went wrong. My iPad ran out of power. At one point, my laptop lost the amount of memory it needed to run the application. So I've had a lot of practice to mess this up royally, which is fantastic. So I'm learning a lot just about our situation right now, and hopefully you all have been staying safe and have not been not had to subject yourself to going out in public too much, I hope. Anyway, here we are, and I know that last week we were supposed to talk about race in politics because if you'll recall, we left off with gender in politics 2 weeks ago, and last week I got sick. And this week we were supposed to talk about generational differences in politics and in voting, and we could do all 3 of those. Sort of recap gender, talk about race, and talk about generational differences, all in this same video by talking about what the heck we saw last night. Now, some of you are probably thinking, why would we have to talk about the presidential debates? The rest of you know exactly why we have to talk about the presidential debates. In a political communication class, it is key to understand these debates and why they're important. Now, when I went into the debate last night, it was not my intention to have to talk about it today. But it was just such a bizarre experience that I have to address it. And I've had some people ask me about it. And most of the time people are asking me for my opinion. And I could certainly give you my opinion, but it'll probably be obvious by the end of this video. And my opinion is not nearly as important as us just understanding how we got here, not just with Trump as president or Biden being his competitor, but how we got to where we are with presidential debates and what role they have played in campaigns before, what role they should play, and what role they're playing now, which we may not get an answer to for a while. So let's talk about where this comes from. And first we have to talk about history. A lot of times when I'm asked about presidential debates, people start talking about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Well, for those of you who have any grasp on history, you know that there were no presidential debates at that time for Lincoln, and also that he would not have been debating a guy named Douglas. But those debates were actually for the Senate seat in Illinois, I believe, not governor, Senate seat in Illinois. And they were long, and they were outside in the elements. And a lot of people showed up. And when I say they were long, I don't mean like, oh my God, when is this 90 minutes going to be over? I'm talking like hours. Why? Because not only were they letting people see them, that wasn't the important part. The important part was talking to them about policy, what was best for Illinois, not just why I should be able to represent you, that I'm a good person, I'm up here. So obviously that's the case back then, but also because I do know about policy and I have a better policy than my opponent. And that's what it came down to. And when you're discussing policy, it's unfortunately an extremely long and difficult process. And so when people talk about the great debates, which are the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they're really talking about a senatorial debate around an entire state. They're not talking about presidential debates, which ended up being a little bit different by the end. So fast forward a little bit to radios entering into the foray, televisions entering into the foray. We had FDR with his fireside chats on the radio, making people feel like they were closer to the president. It was the first time some of them had ever heard their president's voice, let alone seeing them by 1960 when they were on television. the media did in fact impact presidential debates, and they didn't used to be part of campaign activity. This was not necessarily something that you had to do, but it became something that voters now expect. And so let's talk about how that happened. In 1960, it was proposed that in order for the presidential candidates to really be understood and known, they should probably be on that new fandangled machine called a television. Those who had televisions really felt like, oh my goodness, the candidate is right in my living room. Like very literally, they felt that close to them. There was a sense of immediacy that was immediately established. There was a sense of connectedness. But there were also some other things going on. First of all, still not everybody could afford a radio, let alone a television. And so few people had a radio, a television, and a telephone. Why do I bring that up? Because very few people were able to watch the debates. Very few, although more than the TV, were able to listen to the debates. And unless they went to a neighbor's house or the bar or something, they might not have had the opportunity to listen. But if they did, they certainly didn't have the money to have a telephone. And that becomes important when we look at studies of the time that talk about these debates. According to one of the most famous studies, those who watched the debate on television said that Kennedy won because of his style, his delivery, his look. But people who listened to it on the radio felt that Nixon won. And this implied in some way that Nixon was all content and Kennedy was all style and good looks. But that actually has been debunked. That research is flawed in a lot of ways, not the least of which is not that many people had telephones, not that many people had radios, or if they had radios, they probably didn't have telephones, and not that many people had televisions and telephones. So how they did that research had to be mainly on the super rich in a lot of ways, or at least the very well off, the upper middle classes at the very lowest. And so who they were talking to impacted how they felt about the candidates. It impacted whether they were Democrats or Republicans, quite frankly. And here we see a shift because the Republican Party tended to be viewed as the party for the poor more than the Democratic Party. But that flipped around. But you could see how this works. You have essentially the American royalty, the Prince of American royalty, John F. Kennedy, running for office for the Democrats. And people really felt like, yeah, well, you guys are all about the money. So clearly you don't want this hardworking Nixon guy who comes from a blue-collar family. And that eventually flipped. And one of the times that flipped actually was during the Kennedy presidency, which is a different discussion for a different course. But for our purposes, it's important for us to understand that, yes, Kennedy looked better. Yes, Nixon sweat a lot. Yes, Kennedy went out yachting. He looked very tan and very rested, whereas Nixon was up all night practicing and practicing and practicing. There could be good reason for that, by the way, because little known factoid, what's a factoid? I don't know. Little known fact, let's try this, true fact, Nixon and Reagan debated each other in college. Isn't that crazy? Like, I don't think I could ever think of a team that I've debated that I thought, wow, they'll go on to be president someday. Just, being a debater myself more recently than that, but a long time ago. But I can tell you that surprise of surprises, I was looking on Facebook the one day at my old high school debate region, District 5. I was looking at it and I thought, wow, that's fascinating. There was a post that said, hey guys, just remember, no matter what, you debated Spock. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it turns out that the young man whose name is escaping me, I didn't even look it up in between takes. Imagine that. The young man who played Spock in the new Star Treks, that young man is from Pittsburgh, and he was a freshman when I was a senior. And so there's pictures of him at his high school. That clearly, at some point I may have debated him or competed against him. And I hope I beat him. He was a freshman and I was a senior. But, we don't pay attention to those things. We don't look at people and go, oh, that person's going to be famous someday, let alone president of the United States. And so Nixon had very traditional training in debates. Now, Kennedy was a debater, and in fact, he was a debater a lot later than Reagan and Nixon for obvious reasons, just an age difference. And Reagan and Nixon were, almost 20 years apart, 16 to 20 years apart in their presidencies even. But Kennedy was able to look relaxed and confident while making Nixon looked like he was searching for particulars and specifics. Now, their debates were actually fairly long and were focused on policy. They were not focused on so much on looks, believe it or not. That was actually not really a thing. And I don't know about you, but whenever I watch black and white, I can't tell the difference between, a shadow and them sweating. And it's hard for me to see. But back then it would have been such an advanced thing. It would be sort of like if people now watched, the 2D Disney movies. They tend to be very, flat, literally, to them, as opposed to the more 3D, 4K kind of stuff that we get now. In fact, I remember them talking about Wreck-It Ralph, the second movie where he breaks the internet. That one, they could not figure out how to make Pocahontas 3D like the other princesses because, of course, her movie was old enough, her and Ariel from The Little Mermaid. So as tech and media change, so doth our politics. And I said that before, and we've never really talked about it in terms of a specific campaign event like a debate. Media actually dictates what happens to debate then, and media law, by the way. So these debates really were long, and they were policy focused. And people did listen and people did watch, and the research about that is flawed. Keep that in mind. But Kennedy did go on to win handily, despite his age, which was very young, or Nixon's older age compared to Kennedy. He was certainly by no means too old to be president, but he was older than Kennedy significantly. And so people talked about that, how much older he looked, and therefore we want a younger president. And some people said he's too young, he's inexperienced. We've heard these arguments before. Obama wasn't experienced enough. Ronald Reagan was too old. Donald Trump is too old. Hillary is too old. We haven't seen a truly youngin' since Dan Quayle, who was the vice president to George H.W. Bush. Back in 88. And so really age as a discussion is as old as debates themselves and possibly older. And there has never been a real discussion about race or gender. In 1984, Geraldine Ferraro was running as really the first major party vice president who happened to be female. Of course, that changed with Sarah Palin in 2008. But we waited a long time before we saw another, woman, sex-wise woman, running for that office. And I know we read about the feminine style a couple weeks ago, and we also talked about the difference between sex and gender. And here we're talking about sex, honestly. And so we had that new thing come out in 2008, which was, I can't do math, 24 years, I think, after 1984, unless my math is really, really bad. I think that's right. And so that is a quarter of a century. That is a really long time to wait for just a person of a different sex to come along, let alone a person of a different color. And so people of color have been greatly underrepresented, just as women have, and of course they've had a harder time. But when President Obama was elected, people started defending that by saying things like, he's not that black, he's only half black, and more offensive commentaries, which are really, quite frankly, out of line. Now, if you want to read about that, I'm going to give you some suggested reading in your new announcement, I think, for this video so that you know where I'm getting my information from. A couple of colleagues and I, one from the University of Northeastern University in Illinois, and one of them from New York University in New York. That New York University, the big one. We did some research on this, on basically on race and politics solely, sort of in a moment-by-moment response. How did people respond moment to moment when they watched a person of color versus a white person? I don't know what else to say there, that they responded differently. And we all do, whether we want to admit it or not. And so what we need to do is start understanding that. And we have not done good studies on race. I mean, there have not been good studies on race in politics, just like there haven't been a lot of great studies on women in politics. But certainly they're more numerable, at least. I mean, there's a far greater interest in studying gender than there is in studying race and politics. And my friends and I are trying to change that, of course. But I'm white, so is one of my other colleagues, but the other one is black. And so when we were doing our research, he would say, I have to stay out of the room. I can't go in there and do this because I will bias or I will skew the results if people know that I'm a person of color and I'm coming in there. So there was commonly this instant where Charlton would come out after and people would be like, oh gosh, they'd be uncomfortable. And, you know, he identifies himself and says, yes, I am a black person. Don't worry, it's okay. And he ends up reassuring everybody at the end that it's okay that there was a person of color watching this research go on. It wasn't a lie. It was just a way to keep everything as, I don't know if the word's unbiased, I don't think that's it, but we were trying to replicate the experience that people might have of just sitting in their living rooms watching TV and seeing a political ad for either a person of color or a person of different ethnicity that might appear more brown or more white, just depending. So that book came out in 2017, I believe, and that's, I believe, one of the more recent studies that we have. So I'll have you check that out. And this year, we're going to possibly have that discussion again when we have Kamala Harris, Senator Harris, who is running for vice president. Of course, she'll be up against Mike Pence, and she identifies as a person of color. So she's also female. She's a woman. So that's going to be an interesting experience for us to see how that plays out in the debate itself. In fact, I would almost argue that of the debates this year, that will be the only one worth watching. We've known Joe Biden and we've known Donald Trump for a very long time, very long time. Both of them are old white guys. Both of them have stuck their nose in politics in various different ways. Biden by actually serving, Donald Trump by sharing his money however he wanted. He did a great deal of support, if I recall correctly, for Hillary Clinton or for Bill Clinton back in the 90s. So I don't know what his political stance was prior to him running under the Republican Party. But my point is that we know these guys. We know them well. Now, for someone who lived in Ohio, Mike Pence is not that new to me. I mean, the bordering state was run by him. He had a radio show that I could hear if I wanted to. So he's not new to me, but to most of America, they didn't know what they were getting when Mike Pence came into the picture with Donald Trump. So they learned as it got closer to the election, and you learn as much as you want to learn about candidates. You know, Kamala, she's much more outspoken, of course, so we'll know what we're getting with her. So we don't need necessarily what the fireside chats, the Lincoln Douglas debates, or what the 1960 debates gave people, which was knowledge about the candidate. We are used to seeing our presidential candidates. We are used to knowing what their voices sound like. We are not in the dark about this. Interesting other point of fact, Donald Trump said, you don't want to wait weeks or, God forbid, months to find out who your president is. Well, first of all, it was that way for the majority of our country. Probably not until, the last really from the 1970s on, that we really had immediate analysis and immediate results. That wasn't really possible. And there was certainly no internet reporting or a Nate Silver, 538. There was none of that happening. That's very, very recent. And in addition, in 2000, which I forget, but some of you might not have yet been born, in 2000, when there was the debate about who won that was left up to the Supreme Court, it was a while before we found out who the president was actually going to be. In fact, it was long enough that I considered moving to Canada. That's how long it was. It was a long time, and by our standards, because we expect to know that night or at the latest the next morning. We expect to know quickly. But you can't when there's a decision that has to take more time. For example, with mail-in voting or with a tie of some sort, an electoral college question, a judicial question, and so on. What's interesting is nobody's thinking about this, but it is true. Mail-in voting is done all the time. It's done all the time. I used to mail in my vote as an absentee voter in Pennsylvania when my address was still there, but I was going to college in Ohio. So I'm a little bit confused as to why people question this all of a sudden. And more importantly, people say, well, some votes won't be counted. Guys, gals, ladies, gentlemen, others, I hate to tell you this, but that's been true this whole entire time, because there is a group of people who vote by mail-in ballot all the time. It's called our military. And sometimes those don't get to us in time to be counted. We don't know whether they're making a difference or not, or if they would have made a difference. Just like in 2000, we don't know whether or not, if we had count those ballots in Florida, if Al Gore would have won instead of George Bush, but we'll never know. And that seems to be okay with everybody until this year. This year with the coronavirus, anyone who argues that mail-in voting doesn't work, I don't know what that means, because we've been doing it for literally ever. I mean, if there's one thing in the Constitution, it's the post office. And so, by the way, that's true. You can look it up. So the thing is that's irritating to me is how we're coming to this debate. After 1960, some of you might say, well, where did we go from there? Because there were no debates until 1976. So that's 16 years. That's 4 elections. What took so long? Well, we realized in 1960 that we were violating our own fairness doctrine. The FCC had rules and regulations about fair time. Okay, so if one of the political candidates got, a half hour of network time, then the other candidate had to be offered that same thing. They have to have the opportunity to the same amount of advertising time, to the same prices, and so on. This has changed drastically, but what we used to do is every 4 years, Congress would vote to suspend Section 315 of that Fairness Act in order to make sure that we could have the debates. That is no longer necessary. From what I understand, we've gotten rid of 315. So what's left of the FCC Communication Act, of 1972, it's COPA. COPA is the Child Online Protection Act, which was added, I want to say, in the late 90s to early 2000s, and COPA still stands. So there's still a part of the Federal Communication Act of 1972 that still stands, 1972, that still stands. It's earlier than that. I apologize. And so that fairness doctrine has gone out of the way. We no longer have to worry about it. And that's good, I guess. But we don't do debates until 1976, when we decided to start voting to suspend 315. And of course, who was debating in 76? We go back to, some new faces and some new people, because it has been 16 years. Nixon has resigned. The Vietnam War is over. 76 would have been Carter. And if you're going to ask me who he went up against, I'm going to say Ford, and I'm going to be wrong. So I can't remember. Isn't that terrible? These are the people that we call also-rans. That person also ran, but they did not win. So we forget them. We forget who they are. I should know. It should be on the tip of my tongue, but it's not. I could tell you in 1980, it was Reagan and it was Mondale. So, that was 84. Good try, though. I really, really did try. It was Carter and Reagan in 1980. See? The mind is slipping. It's a sieve. So what happened after 1976? When did the debates change after that? Who was running the debates? And how did we come to terms with the rules of the debates? Why did we end up with such short debates? And why are they no longer about policy? Part of that was that, honestly, on TV, they just didn't want to run these long, boring debates for people. People were not interested in them. So they wanted to shorten them. They needed new rules. So in 1980, 4 years after 76, in case you can't do math, I'm sure you can better than me, we end up with Ronald Reagan debating. And the people who run the show on these things is the Commission on Presidential Debates, the CPD. And the CPD ran or makes the general rules for what's going to happen with the debates. And then others sponsor them. So the League of Women Voters have always sponsored a debate. That's usually the one in St. Louis. And then others sponsor debates, other universities for the most part. It just depends on who has the space, who has the time, who has a moderator, who's going to cover it, and how it's going to play out, who's going to be in the actual auditorium, who's going to be in the audience, and who is going to be allowed to ask the questions. And it used to be that the questions were not known, but by 1976, the questions were getting pre-written or at least run by the campaigns so beforehand so that they could prep their candidate properly. We're almost getting to the point where it's scripted. By 1992, people got so upset with how scripted debates were that they were just like a political ad that just ran for 90 minutes, which at that time we had Ross Perot, who was literally running 30-minute political ads on his own dime, which was fine. But how that worked with the fairness doctrine was problematic. But he ended up on stage with George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton in 1992. And what changed in 1992, aside from having that third-party candidate on the stage in the main presidential debates, is, in fact, that we introduced a new format. And that format is called the town hall debate. And you hear about the town hall debates now like they've been going on since the beginning of time, but they have not. They're actually not that old. I realize 92 sounds like forever ago, and I actually graduated high school that year, and it was my first election that I got to vote in. So the shift in presidential debates was actually kind of a big deal because we anticipated it. We looked forward to it. People who were watching it and people who might be in the audience, oh my goodness, the everyman, the everyday person, the average person, if you will, would be able to ask questions of the candidates and talk about feeling a connection with the candidates. And what ended up happening is just in some ways comical. George H.W. Bush looked at his watch at some point when Bill Clinton was talking as if to, like, what time is it? How much more time do we have to go? When's it going to be my turn again? And he got railed for that. He doesn't care about the people. He just wanted to get out of there. He was bored. You name it. You had Ross Perot. Ross Perot interrupted all the time. So, there's all these jokes about Ross Perot running around going, hey, don't tell me that we could put a squirrel in a barn and light it on fire and call it licorice. That's actually a Dana Carvey joke. I have to give credit where credit is due. He has sort of a reputation, Ross Perot, for being a little bit scattered. Let's put it that way, a scattered billionaire. And so that's how Clinton won the election, because of his style, particularly in the town hall debates, where he was comfortable, where he talked to people. This is where we were introduced to the I feel your pain stories. Narratives became big. All of a sudden, we weren't talking policy. We were talking about how we felt. And that was new. And people have been trying to master that ever since, which gets us to now. I always find it funny when I watch old comedy shows and I'm reminded of some of the gaffes. That's GAFFES for those of you who don't know gaffes. A gaffe is when you make a big mistake, perhaps unintentionally, but you make a mistake. And those gaffes, they become gaffes if they ruin your entire presidential election, your whole candidacy. The campaign goes down the tubes pretty quickly. Some of the more famous ones being binders full of women from Mitt Romney. Also, Mitt I think that same year had a real gem where he said that 47% of people he doesn't care about getting their vote, which was not exactly, that was taken out of context. Actually, both of them, he misspoke. We have candidates who forgot their own plans and policies, like which government agencies they wanted to rid themselves of, Department of Energy, Department of Education, and a third one, I don't remember what it is, and somebody had to tell them it was the IRS. Those are hilarious moments. You have the candidates who got overly excited. They celebrated too much, apparently. They spiked the football in the end zone, and everybody said, yeah, you don't have the temperament to be president. So there are gaffes that we look for, and there are expectations that are set up in debates, or for debates, I should say. And that's the thing. The battle of expectations, who sets the expectations, will determine how well the candidates do from the audience perception. For example, back in 2000, I think it was 2000 when Al Gore was running. In 2000, when Al Gore was running against George W. Bush, everybody said, oh my goodness, George W. Bush, he's a buffoon. He can't string two words together without messing up. He looks surprised when he gets something right. Like, I would go to war. Yeah, that was the right answer. Good job, George. Or whatever. He just didn't seem like the debate type. He didn't do debate in high school or college. His father was, such a good debater, such a good policymaker, I should say. And George W. just didn't have it. And Al Gore was known for being an amazing public speaker, poised. And I mean that in the traditional sense. He was very much a Kennedy-esque speaker. Yes, he was boring and sort of dry as a tree, but he was in fact a good speaker, and they said he is going to crush George W. In these debates. And I'm like, oh, don't say that. People were like, why don't say that? Because his expectations were up here. There was no way that Al Gore was going to be able to meet the expectations in that first debate. And they said W couldn't debate his way out of a paper bag. Oh, that's pretty low, don't you think? So we had this really low bar standard set for W and this really high standard set for Al Gore. So all W had to do was not mess up and say one thing right, and all Al Gore had to do was say one thing wrong, and he was out of there. Well, one of those things that he said wrong really had to do with capital punishment. And so people were like, oh my gosh, he got too cocky, and he lost that debate because our expectations for W were so low that just him not messing up made it look like he smashed that debate, which he didn't, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if he won or lost, because what matters is that from the audience perspective, he did so much better than he was expected to do. Now, fast forward to 2016. What happened? First of all, in the primary debates, we had, 16 people on the Republican stage, I think it was. 9, 8, I don't care. That's ridiculous. There is no way you're going to have a policy discussion with that many people on the stage. Yes, you try to divide it up over 2 nights. Yay for you. But that didn't actually help. The greatest number of debaters, really, in order to ideally get out as much policy as we really should be hearing, if we were evaluating them on policy, which clearly we're not, would be 3 at the most. Okay? So that's our first problem. Our second problem was during the debates where it was just two people, we had someone who literally did not care what the rules were. Now, bear with me a second. I'm not saying that Trump is bad or terrible or anything else. I won't make that judgment. I'll leave that up to you. But the rules were that when one person is speaking in a town hall, the others are sitting down, or they're stepped behind a podium, or they're in the background. In fact, if you watch that 1992 town hall, despite everything else, whenever someone was speaking, they would get up off a stool and they would walk towards the audience and talk to them. And when they weren't speaking, they would step back to their stool and sit down to show respect for the other person. What happened in 2016 was we had a candidate walking behind the other candidate. I would say, Hillary Clinton is not often intimidated, and I don't think it was an intimidation tactic, but it was definitely like, I'm going to steal the camera tactic. No one's going to forget that I'm standing here because you're telling some story. And it's impossible to get yourself out of that situation. I mean, if, one of my geckos was climbing all over my hair right now, as they often do if I have them out, you'd be looking at the gecko, right? You would not be looking at me, and you certainly would not hear my message. And that was sort of the Trump, strategy in that town hall debate that I remember so well from 2016. So what happened last night? I don't know. I mean, was there a format? Was there a topic? What were our expectations? And our expectations were that Joe Biden would slip up. He would have some gaffes, and his stutter, he usually has control of. We were not expecting that to come out last night. But when you have someone interrupting you and you're attempting to deal with your stutter, boy, that's difficult. And we had Trump that exactly as we expected him. He acted as if he was the only one on stage. He was the only one who had to answer. He tried to talk over Chris Wallace. Chris Wallace was not good at moderating that debate. We knew that all of that was going to happen. Joe Biden knew that all of that was going to happen. And what do you do to counter that if you were Joe Biden? Well, there's some strategies that I would use if I knew what I was walking into. The first is let him talk and make an idiot of himself. Hopefully give him enough rope to hang himself with that you can then get him on in the minute or two that you get, because you, Joe Biden, are so much more prepared to answer the question that the American people want. That's how I would have countered that. Do I think that Joe did that? I think he tried, but there's a frustration level, right? One of the things I always say about Joe Biden, he's from Scranton, Pennsylvania, for those of you who don't know. I don't think we've ever had a president from Pennsylvania, so it would be kind of cool to have that. But he's from Scranton, Pennsylvania, the far northeast corner of Pennsylvania. I'm from the far southwest in Pennsylvania. And I said to somebody, I was like, Pennsylvanians don't like it. I don't care what side of the state you're on. I don't care north, south, east, west, Philadelphia Eagles or Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't care if you've never heard of Erie. It doesn't matter. Pennsylvanians do not put up with bullying. Because there's one thing you're not going to do. You're not going to out-talk us unless you're from Jersey. That's the only way you're going to out-talk us. I say that because I have relatives from Jersey. But maybe what happened is that Joe lost his cool, and maybe that was the point. But did he? I heard somebody say to me, well, I just don't know if he has the temperament to be president. If he's going to, yell at people when every time they talk over him, I don't want him in the White House. I'm like, excuse me? I'm sorry. I saw Donald Trump interrupting a lot more than Biden ever did. Not even close. But remember, it's about expectation. We expect Donald Trump to interrupt. We do not expect Joe Biden to say, will you just shut up, man? Or just shut up, man. We weren't ready for that. We weren't prepared for that. Now, I was, because, Joe's been a straight talker since, he was in the Senate. And he admits he made a lot of mistakes while he was there. And I watched him make those mistakes. That still did nothing when he ran for vice president. Most of us didn't get too tied up in his past. Now, when you run for president, you do get more tied up in the past. But to the point that we're pulling out things from 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah, I'm saying 30 or 40 years ago because that's how long Joe Biden has been in office. And when you can't get to Joe Biden, you attack his family. And so that's what they did. They attack Hunter Biden, who has very little to do with how Joe would be as a president, because with the exception of Donald Trump, I have never known an American president to appoint his family to be in the White House. Some of the younger kids, you would see them brought in to show that your president is a family guy. If that's the case, that would be it. Or like, Obama's children, we didn't really see the girls, like, at all. Chelsea was very well hidden. Chelsea Clinton was well hidden until she got old enough to go to college. And by that point, her father was out of the office, but they were still following her around like paparazzi on a starlet, which was weird because she wasn't in that vein and she never wanted to be. So we've never had a president who appointed his sons or daughters into those kinds of positions in the White House. So we're a little confused. It seems that the setup should have been that, yeah, you're going to expect that the Hunter Biden question is going to be brought up, but you would assume that that would be equal. You would assume that Donald Trump would be asked about Ivanka and Jared and Junior and Eric. You would assume that that's the case, but that's not the case because our expectation was we already know about that. We don't need any more information. So what did I think of last night's debate? I don't think it was a debate. It wasn't a debate in any sense that I've researched or participated in. Now, is it possible that we're redefining debates for the rest of our American experiment here, which may be longer or shorter depending? I hope not. I don't know about you, but I don't want to watch debates like that. And it's funny because when I think back on it, I think back at some previous years that I've watched debates where we're like, man, that was just catty. These people were nasty to each other. Mudslinging, we used to call it. 1984, 1980, those were some of the worst mudslinging years if you listen to any of the critics at the time. And I just realized now it was Dukakis who was on the Democratic side against Reagan. See, it took me a little while, but I remembered finally. And so we really get, our expectations have really changed, is what I'm trying to say. And I don't know. Where do you want to see them go? Let's start a discussion about this. What do you think should change or be the same about the way our presidential debate ran last night? Is this the way we should continue, or should we change it? To sum up today, I hope that what you got from this was a little bit of history of how we have presidential debates, why we have them, where they came from, and why they're in the format that they are. And I hope that you also understand that that tradition, which has been practiced, has been broken. In 2016 a little bit, and now in 2020 we're definitely seeing it. And everything that comes up with a debate is about the expectations that we have for that debate and for that candidate. Keep those things in mind. Check Blackboard for the discussion, and I will check in with you all a little bit later next week.